The briefcase sat on the passenger seat, leather worn smooth by years of handling, heavier now than it had ever been. Inside, $3 million rested in neat stacks, bound and counted twice that morning in a bank vault where fluorescent lights had hummed their indifferent song. The car moved through afternoon traffic, windshield wipers pushing against a light drizzle that blurred the edges of everything, softening the world into watercolor uncertainty. Behind the wheel, a man named Garrett Hollies checked his rearview mirror for the third time in as many minutes, though he could not have said exactly what he was looking for. Charlotte was a city that spread itself thin across rolling Piedmont country, neither wholly southern nor entirely modern, caught in that peculiar American state of becoming something it had not yet defined. In the spring of 1993, it was a place where old money still whispered in parlors and new money shouted from glass towers downtown, where tobacco warehouses stood empty beside fitness centers, where the past had not quite released its grip, even as the future pressed insistently forward. Garrett had lived there all his life, 47 years of watching neighborhoods transform, of seeing faces change, while the underlying rhythms remained oddly constant. He was not a man given to unnecessary drama. Those who knew him spoke of steadiness, of a methodical approach to business that had built his small empire one careful decision at a time. He owned properties throughout the region, commercial buildings mostly, the kind of investments that produced modest but reliable returns. His office occupied the third floor of a renovated textile mill, exposed brick and polished concrete floors, a nod to heritage packaged for the present. His secretary, a woman named Iris Pemberton who had worked for him for 12 years, maintained his calendar with precision and guarded his time with maternal fierceness. His accountant, Roland Vance, managed books so clean they practically gleamed. The withdrawal that morning had been planned for weeks. $3 million in cash was not the sort of transaction one arranged casually, even for someone of Garrett's standing. The bank manager had personally overseen the process, counting bills in a private room while Garrett signed forms and listened to carefully worded concerns about security. He had smiled, offered reassurances about armored transport and safe storage, nodded at suggestions he had no intention of following. When the briefcase was finally locked and handed across the table, he felt the weight of it like an anchor, something that might drag him down or keep him steady depending on circumstances not yet revealed. The farm lay 40 miles west of the city, tucked into countryside that still retained some memory of wilderness despite decades of development creeping outward. It was called Ashford Meadows, 200 acres of rolling pasture and pine forest, a white farmhouse visible from the county road, barns that had been recently painted a deep russet red. The property had belonged to the Ashford family since before the Civil War, passed down through generations until it reached a man named Dalton Ashford, who at 63 found himself land rich and cash poor, eager to subdivide and sell to developers who saw potential for luxury homes with pastoral views. Garrett had been negotiating with Dalton for the better part of a year. The deal was complex, involving partnerships and permits, zoning variances and environmental surveys, the kind of layered transaction that required patience and attention to detail. They had finally reached terms both could accept, a price point that reflected market realities, while respecting Dalton's emotional attachment to land his ancestors had worked. The $3 million represented Garrett's share of the initial investment, money that would secure the property while financing began to flow through proper channels. What made the arrangement unusual was Dalton's insistence on cash for this first payment. He had been vague about his reasons, something about tax timing and trust structures, explanations that danced around edges without quite landing on solid ground. Garrett had pressed gently, but Dalton had remained firm, and in the end the deal was attractive enough that the peculiar payment method seemed like an eccentricity rather than a warning sign. Rowland had advised against it, urged wire transfers and documented trails, but Garrett had overruled him. Sometimes, he believed, you had to meet people where they were, accommodate their quirks if you wanted to close the deal. The morning he left, Iris had watched him carry the briefcase from his office with an expression that suggested she was biting back words. She had worked with him long enough to know when argument was futile, but her silence carried weight nonetheless. He had told her he would call when he arrived at the farm, expected to be back by evening, might stop for dinner with Dalton to celebrate the closing. She had written it all down in her precise handwriting, noted the time he departed, 12:45 in the afternoon, under skies that promised rain. The drive should have taken less than an hour. Interstate west to the county highway, then a series of smaller roads that wound through territory where convenience stores gave way to produce stands, where the smell of cut grass and manure replaced exhaust and asphalt. Garrett knew the route well from previous visits, had driven it half a dozen times during negotiations, sitting in Dalton's kitchen drinking sweet tea while they discussed property lines and profit projections. He never arrived. When darkness fell and Iris had received no call, she tried his mobile phone, a bulky device he carried reluctantly and used sparingly. It rang without answer, the sound echoing somewhere unreachable. She waited another hour, called Dalton Ashford's number and got a gruff confirmation that no, Garrett had not shown up. Yes, it was concerning. Yes, they should probably notify someone. By 9 that evening, Garrett's wife, a quiet woman named Maureen who taught piano to neighborhood children, had contacted the police. The investigation began as missing person cases typically do, with questions about state of mind and recent behavior, with searches of routine places and calls to known associates. Garrett's car was a silver sedan, common enough that it blended into traffic, distinctive only in the details noticed by those who knew what to look for. Police traced his likely route, drove the county roads with eyes sharp for any sign of the vehicle. They found nothing that first night, nor the next day, nor the day after that. Dalton Ashford sat for interviews in his farmhouse kitchen, the same room where Garrett had sipped tea and talked business. He seemed genuinely bewildered, repeated that he had been expecting Garrett around 2 in the afternoon, had waited until nearly 4 before assuming something had changed. No, he had not called to check because Garrett had mentioned he might be delayed by the bank procedures. Yes, he had been alone at the farm all day, his wife visiting her sister in another county, no one to verify his account but also no one to contradict it. Investigators pulled financial records with Maureen's permission, interviewed business partners and competitors, constructed a picture of a man whose life appeared remarkably free of obvious threats. Garrett owed no significant debts beyond standard commercial mortgages. He had no known enemies, no bitter ex-partners, no history of disputes that had turned personal. His marriage was stable, his children grown and living their own lives in distant cities, his health good according to his physician. The $3 million became the focus, inevitably. That much cash created possibilities, suggested motives that might otherwise remain invisible. Detectives theorized robbery, a carefully planned interception by someone who knew about the payment. They considered whether Garrett himself might have staged a disappearance, though his history offered little support for such speculation. They looked hard at Dalton, at his finances and his past, searching for evidence of conspiracy or worse. Dalton's records showed a man struggling with agricultural economics, property taxes that climbed while commodity prices stagnated, medical bills from his wife's cancer treatment 3 years prior. He needed the development deal, needed it badly enough that undermining it made no logical sense. But logic and crime did not always align, and so investigators dug deeper, interviewed his neighbors and examined his phone records, traced his movements for the weeks leading up to Garrett's disappearance. Nothing cohered into narrative. The farm yielded no physical evidence, no signs of struggle or hasty burial, no disturbed earth beyond what you would expect on working land. Cadaver dogs walked the property and found nothing that interested them. Metal detectors swept likely spots and returned only the usual detritus of rural life: old tools and bottle caps, fragments of farm machinery rusted into the soil. Weeks became months. The story that had briefly captured regional headlines faded from front pages, relegated to occasional updates that offered no new information. Maureen moved through her days in a fog of uncertainty worse than grief, unable to mourn because death remained unconfirmed, unable to hope because time kept passing without word. The business that Garrett had built continued under management appointed by lawyers, generating income that felt increasingly meaningless. Iris kept his office exactly as he had left it, dusted his desk and watered the plants, maintained his calendar though there were no more appointments to schedule. Roland filed taxes and paid bills, kept the machinery running while wondering if his employer would ever return to claim it. Dalton eventually sold the farm to different developers at a reduced price, the shadow of Garrett's disappearance having tainted the property's appeal. He moved to a smaller place near the coast, left behind the land his family had held for generations. Years passed with the particular weight that unsolved mysteries carry, heavy at first, and then gradually lighter as life insists on continuing despite unanswered questions. Maureen eventually held a memorial service without a body, marked a grave with a stone that bore Garrett's name and dates that included only birth. The death date left blank because certainty remained elusive. She tried to move forward, accepted that closure might never arrive, that some stories end mid-sentence without explanation or resolution. The farm changed hands twice more, subdivided and developed according to plans similar to what Garrett had envisioned. Houses rose on cleared lots. Young families moved in with no knowledge of the man who had disappeared driving toward this land with $3 million beside him. The county road was widened and repaved, traffic lights installed at intersections that had been rural crossroads. The landscape transformed as landscapes do, absorbing history without acknowledgement, growing over the past like kudzu over abandoned structures. Then in the spring of 2007, 14 years after Garrett vanished, a contractor named Ellis Drummond was preparing to break ground on the final section of the development, 3 acres that had been held back because of wetland concerns now resolved through environmental mitigation. His crew was clearing brush and removing old farm structures, a collapsing hay barn and a chicken coop long abandoned, when the excavator operator noticed something odd about the ground behind where the barn had stood. The earth there had settled strangely, created a depression that was not quite natural, too regular in its dimensions. When they began to dig, metal appeared beneath 2 feet of soil and decomposed plant matter, a glint of silver paint weathered but still recognizable. Ellis stopped the work immediately, called his supervisor, who called the county sheriff, who arrived with a sense of occasion born from 14 years of wondering. They unearthed the car carefully, treated it like an archaeological site because that was effectively what it had become. The sedan emerged from soil that had packed around it, roots growing through window seals, rust claiming the undercarriage. The plates matched the registration for Garrett Hollies. The driver's seat held nothing but decay and the patient work of insects. The passenger seat, where a briefcase had rested during that last drive, was empty. The discovery changed everything and nothing simultaneously, answered one question while multiplying others exponentially. Maureen received the call on a Tuesday morning while grading piano exercises at her kitchen table, the same table where she and Garrett had shared breakfast on that last ordinary day 14 years prior. The detective's voice carried a careful gentleness that people use when delivering news that cuts both ways, offering resolution wrapped in fresh uncertainty. They had found the car. They had not found him. She drove to the site with her daughter Claire, who had flown in from Boston within hours of hearing, abandoning work meetings and arrangements without hesitation. The development had consumed the landscape so thoroughly that Maureen could barely orient herself to the farm she remembered visiting once, years ago, when Garrett had first mentioned the Ashford property. Houses stood where fields had rolled, children's playground equipment bright against manicured lawns, basketball hoops mounted above garage doors. The location where they had unearthed the sedan was cordoned off with yellow tape that snapped in the spring breeze. Official vehicles clustered around the excavation site like mourners at a grave. The detective who had made the call, a woman named Sandra Rios, met them at the perimeter. She was younger than Maureen expected, mid-30s perhaps, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she took the weight of unsolved cases personally. She had not been with the department when Garrett disappeared, had inherited the file 3 years ago when the original investigator retired, had read through reports and evidence logs trying to see patterns that others might have missed. Now she stood beside the thing itself, the physical proof that absence could become presence under the right circumstances. The car looked smaller somehow, diminished by time and burial, more relic than vehicle. Crime scene technicians moved around it with methodical precision, photographing from every angle, collecting soil samples, dusting surfaces that seemed unlikely to yield prints after so long underground. The interior was visible through windows clouded by mineral deposits and organic decay, seats stained and collapsed, dashboard instruments frozen at readings that meant nothing anymore. The trunk remained closed, its release mechanism corroded beyond casual opening, requiring tools and patience to access. Maureen stared at it and felt very little, or perhaps too much compressed into a space too small for proper processing. This object had carried her husband toward whatever fate awaited him. It had been the last place he sat, the last manufactured thing he touched with intention. And then it had been hidden, buried with what seemed like deliberate care, concealed behind a structure that would mask the disturbance until time and development brought revelation. Someone had put it there. Someone knew. Claire stood beside her mother with one hand on her shoulder, anchor against currents that might pull the older woman under. She had been 23 when her father vanished, fresh from graduate school and newly engaged, planning a wedding he would never attend. The disappearance had fractured her in ways she was still discovering, created fault lines that stress revealed at unexpected moments. She had learned to live with ambiguity, had built a life that accommodated the permanent maybe of her father's absence, but standing here now, she felt the wound fresh again, unhealed beneath scar tissue. Sandra explained what they knew so far, which was both more and less than Maureen had hoped. The vehicle identification matched Garrett's registration without question. Preliminary examination showed no obvious signs of collision or mechanical failure. The positioning suggested it had been driven to the location rather than transported, though they could not yet be certain. The soil around and above it indicated burial had occurred soon after the car arrived, within days or weeks rather than months or years. Someone had used farm equipment, a backhoe or similar machinery, to dig a space large enough and deep enough to swallow the sedan, then filled it back in and allowed nature to complete the concealment. What they had not found was more significant in some ways. No human remains in or near the vehicle. No blood evidence visible to preliminary inspection, though lab analysis might reveal traces invisible to the eye. And no briefcase, no sign of the $3 million that had sat on the passenger seat during that final drive. The interior had been disturbed beyond what burial alone would accomplish, glove compartment hanging open, seats showing tears that might have been searching hands, or might have been decay and animal activity, determining which would require expertise and time. The reopening of the investigation brought media attention that felt simultaneously urgent and stale, a story both breaking and ancient. Local news stations sent reporters who stood before the excavation site delivering updates to cameras, their faces serious with manufactured gravity. National outlets picked up the thread briefly. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to the timeline and theories. Internet forums filled with speculation from people who had never heard of Garrett Hollies until his car emerged from the ground. The attention was intense, and then, as these things go, it faded when newer mysteries presented themselves, when attention moved on to more recent disappearances. But for those directly connected, the intensity never diminished. Sandra assembled a team, pulled in detectives from neighboring jurisdictions with experience in cold cases, consulted with FBI analysts who specialized in pattern recognition and behavioral profiling. They began again from the beginning, re-interviewing everyone who had spoken to investigators 14 years prior, searching for inconsistencies or details that time might have loosened from memory's grip. Iris Pemberton sat for hours in an interview room, now in her 70s, and retired to a condominium near the city center. She remembered that last day with clarity that seemed almost painful, recalled the expression on Garrett's face when he carried the briefcase out, something she had not mentioned in original statements because she had not known how to articulate it. Not fear exactly, but awareness, as if he were stepping into a current whose strength he could not quite judge. She had wanted to say something, had felt words gathering, but years of professional discretion had kept her silent. She carried that silence now like a stone. Roland Vance had moved to Florida, established a practice serving retirees with estate planning and tax preparation. He flew back for interviews, sat across from detectives in his precise way, and walked them again through the financial arrangements, the unusual cash request, his advice against it. He had reviewed the documents hundreds of times in the years since, searching for something he might have missed, some detail that would explain what became of his most stable client. The numbers never changed, never revealed more than they had on first examination. Dalton Ashford was dead, had been for 6 years, a heart attack while fishing from a pier near his coastal retirement. His widow, Elizabeth, agreed to speak with investigators in her small apartment that smelled of lavender and old paper. She was 80 now, memory sharp in some areas and soft in others, reliable only in patches. She remembered the day Garrett disappeared mostly through her husband's reaction to it, the way Dalton had aged visibly in the weeks after, had carried guilt despite having done nothing wrong that she could see. He had sold the farm and moved them away not just for financial reasons, but because he could not bear the weight of suspicion, the way neighbors looked at him, the questions that had no good answers. The farm itself had belonged to Dalton's family for 5 generations, Elizabeth explained, land that had seen them through wars and depressions, droughts and floods. Losing it had broken something in him, even though keeping it had become impossible. She described the layout as it had been. The barn where Garrett's car was found had been old even then, a structure from the 1920s that Dalton had kept meaning to repair. Behind it had been equipment storage, rusted tractors and plows that no longer functioned, things too large to easily dispose of and too worthless to sell. Anyone familiar with the property would have known that area was rarely visited, hidden from the road and the main house. Investigators pulled property records, identified everyone who had worked the farm in the years before Garrett vanished, field hands who came seasonally for harvest, a mechanic who maintained equipment, neighbors who helped with major projects. They tracked down as many as they could find, conducted interviews that ranged from cooperative to hostile. Most remembered Dalton as fair if demanding, recalled the farm as struggling but not desperate. None admitted knowledge of the buried car, though several noted that burying things on farmland was not unusual: broken equipment or dead livestock, things you wanted gone without the expense of proper disposal. A pattern began to emerge from the interviews, not solid enough to constitute evidence but suggestive nonetheless. Multiple people mentioned a man who had worked for Dalton periodically, handyman jobs and equipment operation, someone who came and went without much documentation. Descriptions were vague and sometimes contradictory, complicated by the passage of time and the unreliability of casual memory. White male, probably 40s, maybe tall or maybe average, might have had dark hair or might have worn a cap that obscured it. He had gone by Ray or Roy or maybe just a nickname that no one quite remembered. Sandra's team tried to track this ghost through employment records and tax documents, found nothing concrete. Dalton had paid for most casual labor in cash, kept minimal records, operated the way small farmers often did in that era before digital tracking made such informality difficult. If this man existed, he had left almost no documentary trace, no social security number associated with the farm, no address or contact information preserved in any file they could access. The forensic examination of the vehicle proceeded slowly, each element requiring careful analysis. The soil layers around and inside the car told a story of seasons passing: spring floods and summer droughts, autumn leaf falls and winter freezes. Botanists examined root structures and determined the burial had occurred approximately 14 years prior, consistent with the timeline of Garrett's disappearance. Entomologists studied insect activity and found patterns suggesting the car had been sealed when buried, windows closed and doors shut, preventing easy access for creatures that might otherwise have colonized it more thoroughly. Inside, technicians recovered items that constructed a partial narrative of that last drive. Garrett's mobile phone, primitive by current standards, wedged beneath the driver's seat with battery long dead and circuitry corroded. Coins in the cup holder, oxidized into a solid mass. Registration documents in the glove compartment, ink faded but still legible. A coffee cup in the holder, the brand from a chain that still existed, marking his last known stop. No wallet, no keys, no briefcase. These absences spoke as loudly as what remained. Luminol testing revealed no blood evidence in quantities suggesting violence within the vehicle. DNA analysis pulled genetic material that matched Garrett from the driver's seat and steering wheel, expected contamination that confirmed his presence, but offered no answers about his departure. The passenger seat held traces of leather dye consistent with the briefcase description, pressure marks suggesting weight had rested there, but nothing indicating struggle or forced removal. The trunk yielded more mysteries. When they finally accessed it, forcing the corroded lock with careful tools, they found it essentially empty. A spare tire flat and rotting, a jack rusted into uselessness, a folded blanket compressed into a rectangle of mildewed fabric. Beneath the trunk liner, in the well where the spare tire rested, technicians discovered something that should not have been there. Currency bands, the paper strips banks used to bundle cash, marked with the name of the institution where Garrett had made his withdrawal. 4 of them, suggesting at least $40,000 had been in the trunk at some point, though no actual bills remained. This discovery reframed theories substantially. If money had been in the trunk, it suggested planning rather than improvisation, security measures Garrett had not mentioned to anyone. It raised questions about whether the $3 million had all been in the briefcase, or if he had divided it, created redundancy in case one cache was compromised. It suggested a level of concern about safety that contradicted his outward confidence that last morning. Sandra constructed timelines on a whiteboard in the conference room that became the investigation's nerve center, traced Garrett's likely route with precision. Bank security footage from the day of withdrawal showed him leaving with the briefcase at 11:45, placing him behind schedule for his stated departure time. Traffic cameras along the interstate captured his sedan at 12:30 heading west, and again at 1:15 taking the exit toward the county highway. After that, electronic evidence disappeared, the route passing through areas where cameras did not yet exist in that pre-surveillance era. The drive time from the last camera sighting to Ashford Meadows should have been 22 minutes. Dalton had expected Garrett around 2 and began to worry by 4 when he failed to appear. This left a window of approximately 3 hours, enough time for something to intercept the journey, for plans to change or disaster to strike. Investigators drove the route repeatedly, timed it under various conditions, searched for locations where a car might have been forced off the road or willingly departed from the expected path. They found 7 possible turnoffs between the last camera and the farm, dirt roads and private drives, access points to properties that had changed ownership multiple times since 1993. Each was investigated, owners interviewed, ground-penetrating radar employed in areas where disturbed earth might indicate burial sites. The process was exhaustive and yielded nothing definitive, no evidence of human remains, no signs of struggle or concealment. Meanwhile, the case attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A retired FBI profiler named Marcus Webb reached out to Sandra, offered consultation without fee because the case intrigued him. He had spent 30 years analyzing criminal behavior, building frameworks for understanding motivation and method. He reviewed all available materials, evidence photos and interview transcripts, timelines and financial records, then delivered an assessment that complicated existing theories. The burial of the car, Marcus explained, demonstrated planning and capability, access to equipment and knowledge of the property. It was not opportunistic, not the panicked concealment of sudden violence, but deliberate removal of evidence. The positioning behind the barn showed familiarity with the location, awareness of sight lines and traffic patterns. Whoever buried the car knew the farm, knew when they could operate heavy machinery without drawing attention, knew how to make something large disappear. But the handling of Garrett himself, if the case involved foul play, showed different characteristics. No body had been found despite extensive searching. If he had been killed at or near the burial site, disposing of human remains would have been simpler by including them with the vehicle. The fact that they had been separated suggested either that Garrett was taken elsewhere, possibly still alive when the car was buried, or that his disposal required different methods, perhaps because time or circumstances prevented dealing with everything at once. The money complicated everything. $3 million in cash was motive enough for multiple scenarios, from carefully planned theft to opportunistic robbery escalating beyond intention. The currency bands in the trunk suggested Garrett had taken precautions, hidden at least some of the money separately, perhaps not trusting even the locked briefcase. If someone had taken the briefcase and searched the car thoroughly enough to find the trunk compartment, they would have taken those bills too. The fact that only bands remained suggested either incomplete searching or that someone had known exactly where to look for what they wanted. Marcus posed a question that reframed the investigation. What if the $3 million was not the primary objective? What if Garrett's disappearance served a purpose beyond robbery? The money might have been taken because it was there, opportunistic acquisition rather than primary motive. But removing Garrett himself, making him vanish so completely, required effort that exceeded simple theft. It suggested personal stakes, revenge or silence, elimination of someone who posed a threat beyond the financial. This perspective sent investigators back through Garrett's business dealings with renewed scrutiny. They examined every transaction from the 5 years preceding his disappearance, looked for patterns of conflict or leverage, searched for anyone who might have needed him gone beyond wanting his money. Rowland provided documentation that painted a picture of careful investing, measured risk-taking, the kind of business practice that avoided generating enemies. But between the lines of contracts and correspondence, investigators began to see possibilities. A property deal 3 years before the disappearance had gone badly. A commercial development in a neighboring county that failed when anchor tenants withdrew before the building was completed. Garrett had been a minority investor protected from the worst losses, but the primary developer, a man named Victor Kress, had been ruined financially. He had declared bankruptcy, lost his home and marriage, ended up working construction for companies he had once competed against. Interviews found him living in a rental house, bitter but seemingly resigned, claiming he harbored no ill will toward those who had survived the collapse he could not. But deeper investigation revealed Victor had a brother, Michael Kress, with a history of violence and poor impulse control. Michael had done time for assault, had drifted through jobs and relationships, had been known to fix problems for his older brother through means that skirted or crossed legal boundaries. At the time of Garrett's disappearance, Michael had been living on a small property adjacent to Ashford Meadows, renting a mobile home on land owned by a cousin. He had left the area 2 months after Garrett vanished, told the landlord he found work in another state, departed without forwarding address. Sandra's team worked to locate Michael Kress, found him in Alabama working at a manufacturing plant under his own name, no effort to hide. He agreed to an interview, flew back to Charlotte at police expense, sat across from detectives with the careful composure of someone who had learned through experience how to navigate these situations. He admitted knowing of Garrett Hollies through his brother's business disaster, acknowledged living near Ashford Meadows during the relevant period, but denied any involvement in the disappearance. His alibi for the day in question was thin, the kind of non-alibi that the passage of time makes impossible to verify or refute. He had been home alone, he claimed, no work that day, no witnesses to his activities. He had not known about the cash withdrawal, had not been aware Garrett was visiting the area that afternoon. The farm neighbor was someone he waved to, but did not know well, had no reason to be on that property, no access to equipment that could bury a car. His answers were consistent but unprovable, a wall of maybe that investigation could not breach. Detectives pushed him on the money, the briefcase that had vanished. If he had taken it, if that was all this was, confession might bring reduced charges, cooperation that prosecutors valued. Michael smiled at this, a slight expression that carried knowledge or might have been recognition of technique. He had nothing to confess, he insisted, had taken nothing because there was nothing to take, knew nothing beyond what he read in papers after Garrett disappeared. He was sorry for the family's loss but could not help them. After 8 hours of interview, they released him, insufficient cause to hold him, insufficient evidence to charge him. The investigation continued through summer into fall, following leads that branched and terminated, dead ends disguised as progress. Sandra worked the case alongside her regular duties, spent evenings reviewing files in her home office while her partner watched television in the next room, patient with her obsession because that was the price of loving someone who carried work's weight home. She built profiles and timelines, searched for overlooked connections, consulted with experts in disciplines ranging from geology to psychology. Maureen called weekly for updates, her voice carrying hope that Sandra hated to disappoint with reports of minimal progress. Claire visited monthly, driving down from Boston on weekends to sit with her mother and sort through old photographs, constructing memory against the erosion of time. They talked about Garrett in past tense now, had finally accepted that whatever happened had concluded long ago, that they were seeking understanding rather than rescue. The evidence that finally provided breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A graduate student at the State University, working on a thesis about soil microbiology, requested access to samples collected from the burial site. His research focused on bacterial composition in disturbed earth, patterns that might help date excavation events in forensic contexts. Sandra approved the request, expecting little, and received 3 months later a detailed analysis that identified something unexpected. The soil around and beneath the car contained elevated levels of specific bacteria associated with petroleum products, patterns suggesting the vehicle had been buried near a location where fuel or oil had been stored or spilled. The concentration was too high to come from the car itself, whose tank had been found nearly empty and whose fluids had not leaked in sufficient quantity to explain the readings. The pattern suggested the burial site had been chosen in part because of existing soil contamination, either coincidental or because whoever buried the car was familiar with the property at a level that included knowledge of where old fuel tanks or equipment maintenance had occurred. Investigators returned to the development site with ground-penetrating radar and historical property surveys, searched for indications of previous structures or storage areas. 50 feet from where the car had been buried, they identified a concrete pad overgrown and invisible at ground level, foundation of a structure that property records showed had been a fuel storage shed, removed in the late 1980s when environmental regulations changed. The shed would have been gone by the time Garrett disappeared, but anyone who had worked the farm in previous years would have known it existed, would have known the area behind the barn held remnants of old infrastructure. This detail narrowed the pool of potential suspects significantly, required not just familiarity with Ashford Meadows, but historical knowledge of its layout and operations. Sandra cross-referenced this requirement with the list of everyone who had worked or lived on the property, found that Michael Kress had in fact worked briefly for Dalton in 1987, summer labor during college break, 6 years before Garrett vanished. It was a thin connection but real, documented in old tax records that placed him on the property during the period when the fuel shed still stood. Armed with this evidence, prosecutors felt confident enough to seek warrants for more invasive investigation. They obtained court orders to search Michael's current residence and workplace, to examine financial records and communication history, to place him under surveillance. The searches yielded no direct evidence of the crime, no briefcase or bundled bills, no items traceable to Garrett. But in a storage unit Michael rented in Alabama, investigators found something that spoke across years. A topographical survey map of Ashford Meadows, dated 1986, marked with notations in faded pencil showing buildings and features long since removed. The map changed everything. Not because it proved guilt with courtroom certainty, but because it demonstrated connection, knowledge that coincidence could not adequately explain. Michael Kress had carried away from that long-ago summer job not just wages, but intimate familiarity with terrain, understanding of where things could be hidden on land that held secrets in its soil. The map showed the fuel shed, marked its location with precision that matched exactly where soil contamination had been found, where someone burying a car would need to understand what lay beneath before digging deep. Sandra sat with the map spread across her desk, studied the faded pencil marks that represented structures no longer standing, boundaries no longer relevant, a landscape frozen at a moment when Michael had been 20 years old and working under July sun for a farmer who needed extra hands. She tried to imagine the calculation required, storing away information that might prove useful years later, or perhaps not calculating at all in that moment, simply absorbing details that would resurface when opportunity and desperation intersected. Either way, the map was memory made tangible, evidence that the past reached forward with patient fingers. The surveillance that followed Michael through his Alabama routines yielded patterns of a life lived small and careful, work and home and little else, as if he had made himself deliberately unremarkable. He drove an older truck, lived in a rented duplex, ate lunch from containers he packed each morning, spoke to coworkers with professional courtesy that never deepened into friendship. Watchers noted the discipline of it, the way he seemed to occupy space without leaving impression, moving through days like someone who had learned to be forgettable. But surveillance also revealed a detail that opened new avenues of inquiry. Once weekly, Michael drove to a bank branch where he accessed a safe deposit box, stayed inside the vault room for approximately 10 minutes, then departed. The pattern was regular as clockwork. Every Saturday morning at 9:15 had been consistent for the entire 2 months observers tracked him. Banks maintained records of box access but not contents, privacy protections that required specific legal instruments to breach. Prosecutors petitioned for a warrant, argued that the timing and regularity suggested behavior connected to the investigation, that evidence of the crime might be preserved in that small metal rectangle. The judge who heard the petition was an older woman named Ellen Cordova, who had presided over criminal cases for 23 years and developed instincts about which threads to pull. She read the accumulated evidence, the map and the soil analysis, the timeline of employment and departure, the gap between Michael's modest income and his apparently comfortable if unremarkable existence. She granted the warrant, signed the order that would open the box, scheduled the execution for the following Saturday when Michael would make his regular visit, timing chosen to prevent destruction of evidence if word somehow reached him first. Sandra led the team that waited in the bank branch, positioned out of sight while Michael entered at his usual time, signed the access log, was escorted by a bank employee into the vault. They gave him 5 minutes inside, time enough to begin whatever ritual he performed, then entered with warrant in hand and the kind of careful authority that anticipated resistance. Michael looked up from the open box with an expression that might have been resignation or relief, difficult to distinguish between the two, as if he had been carrying weight so long that its removal brought ambiguous emotion. The box contained items that told a story more clearly than any confession might have managed. Bundled cash, $47,000 in bills that bore the faint smell of age and the fingerprints of many hands, money that could not be definitively traced, but whose presence required explanation Michael could not provide. A leather notebook, pages filled with dates and amounts, a ledger of some kind, though what it measured remained unclear until analysts could study the entries. And a driver's license, plastic rectangle laminated and preserved, bearing the photograph and information of Garrett Hollies, the license he would have carried in his wallet that last afternoon. Michael was arrested on the spot, read rights he seemed to already know by heart, transported to Charlotte where Sandra and her team prepared for interrogation that would determine whether 14 years of questions might finally receive answers. He sat in the interview room with lawyer present, public defender assigned when Michael declined to hire private counsel, perhaps recognizing that whatever money he had hidden would not stretch to adequate defense. The lawyer advised silence, the standard protection against self-incrimination, but Michael seemed to carry stories that had fermented into poison, narratives he had lived with alone until their weight exceeded his ability to bear them privately. He began to talk. Not confession exactly, not at first, but context, framework for understanding how a person might arrive at choices that later seemed inevitable, but in the moment felt like the only path available. His brother Victor had been destroyed by the development failure, Michael explained, lost everything because of decisions made by partners who protected themselves at his expense. Garrett had been one of those partners, not the worst of them but complicit, present in rooms where deals were structured to shield some while exposing others to maximum risk. Victor had spiraled into depression and rage, talked obsessively about the unfairness of it, how men like Garrett walked away from disasters they helped create, while men like Victor lost their lives to the wreckage. Michael had listened to his brother's pain for 3 years, watched Victor diminish from confident businessman to bitter casualty, marriage ending and prospects vanishing, identity stripped away until all that remained was anger without outlet. And Michael, who had spent his own life on society's margins, who understood what it meant to be overlooked and discounted, had felt that anger as shared experience, collective grievance against a system that protected the protected while grinding down everyone else. He had not planned anything initially, he insisted, had simply moved to the area near Ashford Meadows because rent was cheap and work was available, coincidence that placed him near ground where his brother's enemy would soon travel. But coincidence became opportunity when Michael heard through casual conversation at a county bar that Garrett Hollies was buying the Ashford property, that he was arranging a major cash payment to close the deal. The information came from a friend of a friend who did title work, the kind of small-town gossip that flows through communities without recognition of its potential significance. Michael had absorbed the details, confirmed the timing through careful questions that aroused no suspicion, and realized that justice of a sort might be possible, that taking from Garrett what he had taken from Victor created a symmetry that felt like righteousness. He had watched the farm for days leading up to the scheduled payment, learned the rhythms of Dalton's movements, identified the hours when the property stood empty because Elizabeth was away and Dalton ran errands in town. He positioned his truck on a logging road that intersected the county highway, waited there on the afternoon of Garrett's drive with patience learned from hunting trips, watching for the silver sedan he knew from research would be carrying $3 million in cash. When it passed, he followed at distance, waited until Garrett turned onto the dirt access road that led to the farm's rear entrance, a shortcut that locals knew but visitors might discover through careful map reading. What happened next, Michael claimed, was confrontation rather than ambush, words exchanged before anything physical occurred. He had flagged Garrett down, claimed car trouble, asked for help with a mechanical issue that required just a moment's attention. Garrett had stopped because that was his nature, the kind of man who helped when asked, who saw civic duty in small gestures toward strangers. Michael had approached the driver's window, seen the briefcase on the passenger seat, felt adrenaline and anger merge into something that overrode hesitation. He had produced a pistol, not with intention to use it but as persuasion, leverage to make Garrett compliant. The gun was old, inherited from his father, carried more as talisman than weapon, but in that moment it became the instrument that shifted power between them. Garrett had reacted with shock rather than fear initially, confusion about what was happening and why, questions that Michael answered with accusations about Victor, about justice and consequences, explanations that must have seemed insane to a man whose business dealings had been numerous enough that he might not even remember the specific failure that generated such rage. Michael's voice carried something like regret as he described what followed, though whether genuine remorse or performative emotion remained unclear. He had ordered Garrett from the car, taken the briefcase and searched the vehicle, found the additional cash in the trunk because he understood how cautious men operated, knew that dividing money created backup if primary cash was lost. He had cable ties in his truck, restraints that he used to secure Garrett's hands, necessary control while he decided what to do next. The plan had been robbery, he insisted, taking the money and leaving Garrett tied but unharmed, able to free himself eventually and report the crime, embarrassment but not tragedy. But Garrett had kept talking, kept trying to reason or negotiate, explanations about the business deal and his limited role, offers of more money if Michael would just let him go, promises that grew increasingly desperate as understanding dawned about how isolated they were, how completely Michael controlled the situation. And something in those pleas had triggered Michael, reminded him of every powerful person who had talked their way past consequences, who had used words and connections to escape accountability while others suffered. He had struck Garrett to silence him, single blow that landed harder than intended, dropped him to the ground with suddenness that shocked them both. Michael paused in his narrative, seemed to retreat into memory that remained vivid despite years past, moment that had divided his life into before and after. Garrett had not risen, had made sounds that indicated consciousness but not capability, injury serious enough that hospital became necessary if permanent damage was to be prevented. But taking him to hospital meant exposure, arrest, loss of the money that now sat in Michael's truck representing justice delivered, compensation for his brother's suffering. He had faced a choice that felt impossible, decision that would determine not just his future but Garrett's survival, and he had chosen the path that protected himself even as it doomed the man lying injured in dirt that smelled of spring rain and turned earth. What exactly happened next, Michael would not detail with precision, claimed that memory became fragmented, that trauma created gaps his mind could not or would not bridge. He acknowledged that Garrett did not survive, that the injuries proved more serious than they initially appeared, that attempts at first aid came too late to reverse damage done. He described panic then, the realization that robbery had become something worse, that he now needed to disappear evidence that could end his life as thoroughly as Victor's had been ended. He had loaded Garrett's body into his own truck, left the sedan where it stood while he drove to a location he would not name, a place where disposal could be accomplished with finality that investigation would not penetrate. Returning to the farm after dark, he had used equipment he knew how to operate from that summer years ago, started the old backhoe that Dalton left unlocked because rural areas still operated on trust, dug a pit behind the barn where contaminated soil already existed, where disturbed earth would not show distinctly against the existing disturbance. He had driven Garrett's sedan into the excavation, buried it under layers of soil that he packed carefully, knowing that settlement would occur but hoping years of weather would naturalize the scar. The briefcase and wallet and keys he took with him, disposed of separately in ways that left no trace, kept only the license as proof to himself of what he had done, concrete evidence that memory might otherwise transform into doubt or fantasy. The money he had hidden initially, buried in containers on land he rented, afraid to spend it while investigation remained active, while attention focused on the area and anyone displaying sudden wealth would attract scrutiny. He had left the county 2 months later not to flee, but to create distance, establish himself somewhere new, where he could gradually access the funds without generating questions about their source. Over 14 years, he had drawn down the amount carefully, supplemented his income in ways that appeared legitimate, maintained the appearance of someone living within modest means, while knowing security waited in safe deposit box and buried containers. He visited periodically to refresh his sense of accomplishment. His brother Victor had died without knowing what Michael had done on his behalf, heart attack brought on by stress and dissolution, death that came 5 years after Garrett vanished. Michael had attended the funeral, stood at graveside and felt satisfaction mixed with sorrow, believing he had delivered justice even if his brother never knew it arrived. The money meant less than that feeling, that sense of having balanced scales that society left tilted. He had not spent lavishly, had not sought material comfort beyond security, had used the funds primarily to know he possessed them, that he had taken from someone who had taken from his brother. The confession, if that was the proper term for his narrative, lasted 7 hours across 2 days, recorded and transcribed, witnessed by lawyer who advised against continued speech, but could not prevent client determination to explain. Sandra listened with the particular attention investigators develop, hearing for contradiction or embellishment, for details that evidence could confirm or refute. Much of what Michael described could not be verified independently. Events witnessed only by him and Garrett, claims about intention and accident that served to minimize culpability while acknowledging basic facts. But enough could be confirmed to satisfy prosecutors that they possessed sufficient evidence for charges that would ensure Michael never walked free again. The money in the safe deposit box, while not traceable with absolute certainty to Garrett, carried strong presumption given amount and timing and Michael's inability to explain its origin through legitimate means. The driver's license was physical evidence connecting him to the victim, possession of which required explanation he could not provide without admitting guilt. The map demonstrated premeditated knowledge of the burial site's characteristics, planning that contradicted claims of panicked improvisation. Most significantly, Michael agreed to lead investigators to the location where he had disposed of Garrett's remains, final piece of the puzzle that would give Maureen and Claire what they had sought for 14 years. Certainty, closure, the ability to finally complete the grieving that absence had suspended. He drew maps and provided coordinates, described landmarks that GPS would help identify, negotiated for considerations in sentencing that prosecutors granted because recovery of remains served interests beyond conviction. The site was 4 hours north, national forest land dense with pine and mountain laurel, terrain rugged enough that access required hiking beyond where vehicles could reach. Sandra organized the recovery operation with care that bordered on reverence, assembled forensic team and cadaver dogs, scheduled the attempt for early autumn when weather would be stable and ground workable. Michael accompanied them in restraints, pointed out the route he remembered traveling in darkness years ago, corrected course when terrain did not match memory's map. They found the location on the second day of searching, depression in the ground that dogs indicated with behavior trained specifically for this purpose, alert that meant human remains lay beneath soil and seasons. The excavation proceeded with archaeological precision, team members working in careful layers, photographing and documenting, treating the site as both crime scene and grave. What they recovered was incomplete, remains that time and natural processes had reduced to elements, but enough remained for identification through dental records, for confirmation that ended Maureen's 14-year wait for certainty. She received the notification in person, Sandra driving to her home rather than delivering the news by phone, respect that circumstances demanded. Claire was there, had come down from Boston when word arrived that the search was underway. Mother and daughter sitting together in the living room where piano still stood in the corner. Instrument Maureen no longer taught because students required attention she could not consistently provide. They held each other as Sandra explained what had been found, where Garrett had been all these years, the distance he had traveled from his intended destination into isolation he had not chosen. The grief was complex, layered with relief and anger and exhaustion, emotions that competed for precedence while shock tried to protect them from full impact. Maureen asked questions about suffering, whether Garrett had been afraid, how long consciousness had persisted, details Sandra deflected with gentle skill because some answers brought comfort while others created new wounds. What she could confirm was that Garrett had not abandoned them by choice, had not orchestrated disappearance or sought escape from life he had built, had been taken from them by someone whose grievance had nothing to do with the man Garrett actually was, and everything to do with symbols and projections. The trial proceeded through the following spring, prosecution presenting case that built methodically from evidence and confession, defense attempting to frame events as manslaughter rather than murder, accident escalating beyond control rather than intentional killing. Michael testified in his own defense, repeated the narrative he had constructed, claimed remorse that might have been genuine or might have been performance-tuned for jury consideration. Character witnesses described his brother's collapse, attempted to create context for anger, even while acknowledging that context did not justify outcome. The jury deliberated for 3 days, returned verdict that found Michael guilty of second-degree murder, robbery, and evidence tampering, charges that carried sentences totaling life with possibility of parole after 30 years. The judge who pronounced sentence, the same Ellen Cordova who had granted the safe deposit box warrant, spoke about justice and consequences, about choices that ripple forward through time creating damage that cannot be undone. She acknowledged the tragedy of Victor's business failure, while emphasizing that private revenge created new victims rather than restoring balance, that Michael's actions had destroyed a family while claiming to defend one. Maureen attended the sentencing, sat in the courtroom gallery with Claire beside her, and listened to the formal language that wrapped horror in legal terminology, made violence comprehensible through structure of statute and precedent. She felt nothing like satisfaction, discovered that conviction brought only exhaustion where she had hoped for something resembling peace. Michael looked smaller in the defendant's chair than she expected, diminished by circumstances in ways that might have generated pity if she had possessed any to spare. When given opportunity to address the court before sentencing, he turned to where she sat and offered apology that words could not adequately carry, acknowledgement that he had stolen not just life but years of uncertainty, grief suspended in amber of not knowing. She did not respond, had nothing to say that would bridge the space between them, found that facing him generated only numbness where emotion should have lived. Claire held her hand with pressure that anchored her to present moment, prevented her from drifting into the what-ifs that had haunted 14 years of waiting. When the session concluded, and Michael was led away to begin serving consequences of choices made on a spring afternoon that had seemed to him like opportunity for justice, Maureen stood and walked from the courtroom into sunlight that felt both ordinary and impossible, continuation of a world that had not stopped despite all that had been lost. The burial service happened in June, gentle morning with clouds that suggested rain, but delivered only breeze. Gathering of family and friends who had marked Garrett's absence with memorial years earlier, but now could properly lay him to rest. The casket was closed, contained remains that forensic processing had finally released. Body returned to family after serving as evidence in pursuit of accountability. The minister who presided had not known Garrett personally but spoke about loss and memory, about how love persists beyond death and through uncertainty, about faith that understanding comes even when we cannot perceive the larger pattern. Maureen stood beside the grave with Claire, and with grandchildren who had never known the man being buried, legacy extending into generations that carried his name without his presence. Friends from his business years attended, including Iris, who wept quietly into tissue held with trembling hands, and Roland, who stood with the rigid composure of someone holding emotion in check through sheer discipline. The property developments Garrett had worked toward stood completed now. Houses occupied by families who did not know the story of the man whose vision had shaped their neighborhoods. Ordinary lives unfolding on land that had been transaction and tragedy. Sandra came to the service though she had not been invited, stood at the perimeter in civilian clothes rather than the professional attire of investigation, witness to the closure her work had made possible. Maureen saw her there and approached after the ceremony concluded, thanked her with words that could not possibly convey the full weight of gratitude for persistence across years when easier paths would have been to let the case remain cold, filed, and forgotten. Sandra accepted the thanks with understanding that solving the case had been duty, but attending the burial was choice, personal recognition, that investigations were not just puzzles to solve but human stories requiring acknowledgement. In the months that followed, Maureen began the slow work of constructing life beyond grief suspended, moving forward not because pain had lessened, but because continuation demanded it. She returned to teaching piano, found that music offered structure that helped organize days into meaningful increments, that focusing on students' progress provided purpose outside her own processing. Claire visited more frequently, brought her children south for weekends that became traditions, filled the house with noise and life that pushed back against the silence that had accumulated during years of waiting. The money, what remained of it, became object of legal dispute, prosecutors seeking to recover funds for Garrett's estate, while Michael's defense argued that much had been spent in ways that could not be clawed back. Eventually, a settlement returned approximately $30,000, fraction of what had been taken but symbolically significant, acknowledgement that some measure of what was stolen could be restored. Maureen donated it to organizations supporting families of crime victims, finding that transforming pain into purpose offered its own form of healing, connection to others navigating similar landscapes of loss. The farm where Garrett's car had been buried continued its transformation into suburban development, final lots sold and built upon, landscape fully domesticated into planned community, with homeowners association and covenants that regulated everything from paint colors to mailbox styles. No marker indicated what had happened there, no acknowledgement that the ground held history beyond agricultural heritage celebrated in neighborhood names. The past was paved over literally and figuratively, allowed to sink beneath surfaces of present concerns, remembered only by those whose lives it had directly touched. Sandra moved eventually into cold case division permanently, found that the work suited her temperament, patience required to extract truth from years of accumulation. She kept a photograph from Garrett's case in her desk drawer, not crime scene image but family photo Maureen had provided during the original investigation, picture of Garrett with Claire as a child, casual moment at beach somewhere, both smiling at something outside the frame. She looked at it occasionally when cases seemed impossible, reminder that persistence served real people rather than abstract justice, that solving puzzles meant giving families the ending that uncertainty had withheld. Michael adjusted to prison with the same quiet discipline he had shown in free life, became model inmate who worked in the library and avoided conflicts, decades stretching ahead of him with certainty that mimicked in reverse the years he had taken from Maureen. He wrote letters occasionally, not to the family he had destroyed because that would have been unconscionable, but to a prisoner advocacy group, attempts to process what he had done through written reflection. The letters were rambling and self-justifying, circles of logic that tried to maintain distinction between intention and outcome, but buried in the rationalizations were moments of clarity, where he acknowledged that justice he had claimed to seek was only vengeance dressed in righteous language, that his brother's pain had not been alleviated by creating equivalent suffering for others. Years accumulated the way they do, individual days that seem endless compressing into months and seasons that pass with increasing speed. Maureen grew older with grace that came from surviving what should have destroyed her, resilience built not through strength, but through simple refusal to let grief become her entire identity. She thought of Garrett daily, but the thoughts changed quality, became memory rather than open wound, appreciation for what had been rather than only loss of what might have continued. On the 20th anniversary of his disappearance, she drove to the cemetery alone, brought flowers she arranged on grass that had grown thick over the grave, sat on the bench nearby, and allowed herself time to simply be present with absence. The day was ordinary, unremarkable spring afternoon, with temperature mild and sky indifferent, world continuing its rotation, without acknowledgement of significance the date held. She spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear, told Garrett about grandchildren and changes, about how the city had grown and how the business he built continued under other names, about how she had survived the unsurvivable and found reasons to continue. When she rose to leave, she felt something like peace, not happiness or closure in the way that term suggested completeness, but acceptance that life contained mysteries solved and questions that would never receive answers, that understanding came in fragments rather than revelation, that love persisted beyond death and through the complications of how death arrived. She drove home through familiar streets, parked in the driveway of the house they had bought together when they were young, and everything seemed possible, climbed steps where his feet had walked thousands of times, entered spaces that held his presence even in his absence. The story, as stories do, became part of the larger narrative of the place, remembered in different ways by different people. Some recalled it as cautionary tale about trusting appearances, about how violence could arrive in ordinary moments without warning. Others saw it as example of investigation persistence, case solved when many went cold, dedication that honored victims by refusing to forget them. For those who had loved Garrett, it remained primarily personal, loss that shaped them even as life moved forward, permanent alteration to the landscape of their hearts. But perhaps the truest legacy was quieter, less definable, found in the way Maureen chose to live the years she was given after certainty finally arrived. She embraced life not because pain had ended, but because continuation itself became act of defiance against the violence that had tried to write the final chapter. She taught music and tended gardens, traveled to places Garrett never saw and brought him with her in memory, found joy in grandchildren's laughter and satisfaction in small kindnesses offered to strangers. She transformed grief into something that resembled wisdom, understanding that we do not control how our stories begin or end, but we author the meaning we extract from them, the person we become through surviving what we cannot change. In this way, through the simple act of continuing, of choosing engagement over withdrawal, of building life from the fragments that remained after loss and revelation, she wrote an ending more powerful than any investigation could provide, created resolution, that was not about justice delivered or explanations received, but about the human capacity to endure, to love beyond death, to find light even in the darkest chapters of our shared human story.